We're here with Bill Cromwell today, and Bill, one of the things I wanted to ask you is if you could explain the dyslipidemia of insulin resistance to our police officers and firefighters. How are people different metabolically when they're insulin resistant?
Sure. So insulin resistant is a term that we use for folks that are in the process of going from a normal glucose metabolism to stages where they have abnormal glucose metabolism, that is before they get to type 2 diabetes. There's a series of changes that take place as that happens. One of the things that happens is a characteristic lipid and lipoprotein problem that's early in insulin resistance. The way that works is that fat cells early in insulin resistance have trouble holding on to what are called free fatty acids. That's actually the fatty elements that are in fat cells. When free fatty acids leave the cells and get into the circulation, they will go to the liver, and the liver will take those pieces like building blocks and make triglyceride. So as the liver is doing what it does, making triglyceride, that triglyceride either has to be packaged and exported out of the liver, or it has to be burned, and we call that beta oxidation, or it's going to sit there and form a fatty liver. So the body is programmed not to get a fatty liver. That's something it doesn't want. And the way you take triglyceride and export it is to package it into lipoprotein particles called very low density, or VLDL lipoproteins. So this stepwise process that takes place early in insulin resistance is that free fatty acids increase in the blood, triglyceride is increasingly made in the liver, VLDL particles assemble to get rid of the triglyceride, and that starts a series of changes that we see at a lipoprotein level. And these changes have to do with the way that different lipoproteins interact with each other. So we've already introduced one term, VLDL, very low density lipoprotein, carries triglyceride away from the liver. The body breaks that down in a sequential fashion, and in the end of the process, another type of particle that people have heard a lot about, LDL, low density lipoprotein, is created. So the more VLDL you have, the more LDL is made. One consequence of increased numbers of VLDL particles is that you will have increased numbers of LDL particles. Now, there are different reasons why some VLDL will give rise to discrete types of LDL. Large VLDL particles give rise to small LDL particles. So what we're beginning to see now is the linkage of how the lipid and lipoprotein problems begin to show up in insulin resistance. Increased numbers of large VLDL particles translates directly into increased numbers of small LDL particles. Now, the other thing that happens is that there is an enzyme that our bodies have called cholesterol ester transfer protein. And CETP is a broker. It exchanges things. I'll give you a triglyceride if you give me a cholesterol ester. Turns out that VLDL has mostly triglyceride. LDL and HDL have mostly cholesterol. So what happens is this broker enzyme, CETP, will take one molecule of triglyceride from VLDL and give it to HDL and say, in exchange, I'd like your cholesterol, please. And what happens is we give one triglyceride in exchange for one cholesterol several hundred times. If you think about that, what's happening is that what's inside the HDL particle is changing. The cholesterol that it started out with is going down, and in its place it's getting triglyceride. What happens is the body recognizes that that's not correct. HDL particles are not supposed to have extra triglyceride. So another enzyme comes in called a lipase. These can be hepatic lipase or endothelial lipase. Lipases break up triglyceride, and much like air leaving a balloon, when the triglyceride is liberated, the particle becomes smaller in size. So then large HDL particles go down, small HDL particles go up, and that's the third thing that happens at a lipoprotein level in insulin resistance. So we had increased numbers of large VLDL particles, increased numbers of small LDL particles, decreased numbers of large HDL particles. Those together are very, very predictive of early insulin resistance. It can precede sugar problems by a good decade. And so when we see that on blood tests, it tells us the genes for insulin resistance have turned on, and left untreated, what these people are going to do is over time have a propensity toward higher sugars, a propensity toward a greater transition to type 2 diabetes, and a problem with more and more LDL particles without having a very high LDL cholesterol. So all these things kind of pack together.
Every time we do our presentations, we're getting in that phrase, it's not the particles, it's the cars. So maybe that can lead into, so.
Yeah, so we can talk about LDL and cholesterol in LDL and particles and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, why particles are the key thing.
Yeah.
Okay, so.
Sure.
Okay, here comes.
Are we going to be using that?
He's going to do
Yeah,
it.
well, yeah, if we can have it off camera and I can reach for it and bring it on camera,
Yeah.
that would be helpful. How about that?
Sure.
Yeah,
Okay.
okay.
Dr. Cromwell, I don't know who first said, it's not the passengers, it's the cars. The first time I heard it was from Dr. Richmond.
Mm-hmm.
Who came up with that first?
I don't know.
The first time I heard it was from Michael Richmond, and he said it in a presentation to the Hermosa Beach Fire Department that we show to our firefighters
Right.
all the time, and it's it goes over very well. But in the context of lipoproteins, in the context of risk from lipoproteins,
Right.
what does that really mean? What does that phrase mean, that it's not the passengers, it's the cars?
Well, let's go back. Let's go back to 1950. So it turned out that at that time there was a lot of controversy as to how cholesterol was made and moved around the body. Since cholesterol is a fat and blood is mostly water, oil and water don't mix. So a lot of interest was, how do you move cholesterol around? And there were a couple of ideas. One was that maybe it's bound to proteins like albumin. Maybe it is carried inside something, whatever that something is. And there was a man by the name of John Goffman. John was a physicist who went back to medical school. I'm not sure why he got intrigued in cholesterol metabolism, but he was. And John, through a series of very elegant studies, actually characterized the way cholesterol gets transported. And what he was the person to define were the presence of lipoprotein particles. So he correctly identified and characterized and isolated the lipoproteins, which are kind of like tennis balls. Tennis balls of different size. There's a spherical vehicle, if you will, and it's hollow on the inside. And that hollow interior will contain cholesterol, ester, and triglycerides. So this is the way that cholesterol moves around. It was his model back in 1950 that is still true today, and that is that these particles floating through the blood can enter the arterial wall and either, in some cases, increase risk of disease or decrease risk of disease. The movement of particles is a gradient process. The more particles in the blood, the more make their way into the wall of the artery. Just like more cars on the road, more take the exit ramp. So a lot of punitive particles, as he called them, LDL particles, will increase risk for heart attacks. And protective particles, HDL, have characteristics which could decrease the likelihood. Now, the question is, if these particles are influential by how many are present, how do you know how many are there? You have to measure something. It is not the case that back in 1950 there were a great number of technologies widely available. What he was using was something called analytic ultracentrifugation, which existed in 3 areas in the country at that time. So this could not be done by the masses. What was thought perhaps would be helpful would be to measure the lipid inside the particle, because cholesterol tests are fairly easy to do. And therefore, if we could measure what's being carried, that would tell us something about the particle itself. Well, it sounds like it would work. There's one problem. So I've got a glass, and let's say that this glass has about 6 ounces of liquid in it. If that glass predictably always had 6 ounces, then if I told you there's 12 ounces, you would know there would be 2 glasses, each with 6 ounces apiece. But if it's the case that that glass can contain a highly variable amount of liquid, anywhere from 1 ounce to 6 ounces, then I really can't know how many glasses there are just by knowing the amount of liquid. Similarly, if we're using cholesterol to infer how many particles are present, we don't do a very good job because of the amount of cholesterol variability per particle. This is where I think the phrase of "it's the cars, not the passengers" come from. The passengers would be like the liquid in the glass. If we're counting passengers and every car had 2 people in it, then we would know how many cars just by the number of people. But if the cars could have either 1 person or 6 people, you can immediately see where knowing the number of people wouldn't equal the number of cars. In a more elegant way, if you want to put it analytically, we call this idea of 2 measures being similar concordance, or 2 measures being different discordance. If the question is how many LDL particles do I have, I've got the liquid, cholesterol, that's one point of reference, but it can vary. Or I have the particle, the glass, as another point of reference. What happens if there's agreement between the liquid and the glass, or in this case cholesterol and the number of particles? Well, then either one does a great job in predicting who's at risk and how they're responding to therapy. But if they differ significantly, if the particle number is very different than the cholesterol, we have to ask another question. Are there outcome studies where we know heart attack rates and we follow people over time, which would tell us which measure of LDL, the cholesterol or the particle number, is predictive of the events observed? Now, after 3 decades of work, what we can say is consistently, when those 2 measures differ, particle number predicts, cholesterol does not. And that has tremendous value when we see people one at a time. Because when I see one patient at a time, what I need to know is, do you have an increased number of the punitive particles? Do you have a lot of LDL particles? If you do, we're not done yet. If we've treated you and your particle number has come down to a point which is likely going to decrease your risk of heart attacks, stroke, death down the road, you've had a good response to therapy. To judge that from a cholesterol test is very, very difficult. And now what we have are opportunities for expert bodies to think through this, look at the data, look at the outcomes, and suggest what we might consider doing in addition to our usual cholesterol testing. And consistently now, 4 different expert bodies have concluded that we need to consider measuring and managing how many particles are present as our final target of therapy before we declare somebody has had a good response.
That's why ATP4 is going to say no particle number.
ATP4, I think, is going to continue to default to an epidemiology point of view, and
Not
so
a single patient.
yeah, you know, it took me. I must be a slow learner here, I guess, but I never could quite figure out why smart people that were friends of mine differed so much from where the data I saw taking us. And then it occurred to me, where did ATP come from? The National Cholesterol Education Program. Well, what was that? That was an epidemiologic exercise to take us from a higher cholesterol to a lower cholesterol average in the population, knowing that there would be relative risk reduction. Well, that's a good population-based exercise. There's nothing wrong with it. And since it hasn't been operationalized completely yet, you can say we still have unfinished business. Now, having done that well, does that mean that you or I have a predictable response at a particle level based on our cholesterol? No. So it's really not the case that ATP has weighed in whether this is a limitation in their thinking or whether we should go to another step. They've basically said in the 2004 update, use your clinical judgment to decide when you have done enough. In my opinion, what that means is that the guidelines from ATP are starting points, not stopping points. They are areas that you should be below as an entry in managing a patient, but it's up to the clinician based on his knowledge of the patient and the nuances of their care as to when you would suggest that person has been well managed. Now, how are you going to do that? How are you going to tell whether somebody has had an individual optimal response to therapy because of the cholesterol variability issue? They have chosen so far to not make that a major point of discussion. This is also why organizations like the American Diabetes Association, the American College of Cardiology, the American Association of Clinical Chemistry, the National Lipid Association have felt it necessary to have that extra step of discussion in saying it's reasonable having achieved lipid entry points, to then ask the question, how's the individual doing, and to consider an extra step to make sure we're not leaving people at a point which is still at a high risk. So these are complementary exercises. Now, whether ATP chooses to incorporate that in their guidelines, I don't know, but if they were silent to it, that would not mean that the work of these 4 expert panels is contradicting ATP. It's just the next step beyond what ATP has chosen to say. This, I think, has confused people because ATP has really carried a lot of water for us. They have, pioneered a lot of our thinking as to what aggressive care looks like, and in so doing have done a great service. But because it's epidemiologically focused, it really doesn't have much visibility to heterogeneity, and discordance, and how does an individual within a population behave, which is what clinicians have to worry about. My individual patient in room 1, not 1,000 people like my patient in room 1.
Dr. Cromwell, one of the things that's really appealing to us about the NMR test is the insulin resistance score. We'd like to know what goes into